Puebla, Batalla de Puebla war, or the battle, Californians were rallying, you know, in not only in preservation of their values and of their customs, but they were facing an expansion of slavery in the United States. So it was during the Civil War, and the belief was that should Mexico fall to Europe, that there was an agreement that slavery would be introduced into Mexico. And during that time, the issue of the day was slavery. And the victory of the Batalla de Puebla was a change in the tide of this expansion of slavery. And a lot of times people don't recall the period in terms of the issues of the day that were so important in the minds of some. Of the states that were of Mexico, with the exception of Texas that had an earlier secession, of those states that came from Mexico, slavery was never introduced into any of the Mexican states, even if the law allowed for some to decide to introduce slavery. And that's the legacy of Mexico, that the values were anti-slavery. So we want to have it during this week. We also have our Latino Caucus Spirit of Awards. We had them Monday and Tuesday recognizing outstanding Latinos in California. And we have some invited guests from Tonalá, some artisans that are putting together an Expo Tonalá on 12th and K that are bringing their artwork. So we're having a busy week this week celebrating California-Mexico binational fairs. And today we have I've prepared an agenda that's rich in discussion on promoting binational trade. How do we increase Mexican investments in California, and how can California cooperate with Mexico in a way that, again, invests in our combined growth? If you combine the GDPs of all the border states, of the border states in Mexico and the border states in the United States, we'd have the third largest economy in the world. So it behooves us to work together with the government of Mexico to see what policies we can promote binationally that will help grow our economy and help create prosperity for our regions. We see, while I'm not against global trade, I'm always in support of investing locally. The best way to grow your economy is to invest locally. And if you can't invest in the next most adjacent geographical area, and depending on how far you expand, Mexico is our closest trading partner to California. And so I'm honored to be part of this committee, and I'm honored that you could be here today. Senator Leyva and Senator Allen, thanks for your presence. We are expecting. We also invited the Assembly committee members to participate in this discussion. We think it's going to be rich in a productive dialogue on the issue of trade. So we want to begin by discussing the ways that we're going to facilitate economic partnerships and the way we're going to foster economic development. Before we begin, though, I'd like to see if our members, our current members, Senator Leyva, Senator Allen, would like to share a few comments.
I just want to thank the chair for asking me to be on the committee, and excited to be here. I'm a new legislator and really look forward to what we can do on this committee. I think that trade with Mexico is very, very important, and I think we can do a better job, and mostly just here to learn and try and better the relationship.
Bienvenidos a todos, es un gran placer estar acá con todos ustedes. Cuando era universitario fui a México para estudiar, y también yo trabajaba con el AmCham, con un internship allá. Entonces estudiamos mucho de los negocios entre los Estados Unidos y México, y después yo trabajaba con el Instituto Nacional Demócrata en proyectos de democratización en México y en otros países. Entonces yo me siento un sentimiento muy especial con México. Tengo muchos amigos en México y para mí es un gran placer ser parte de esta comisión y vamos a estar estudiando todos los asuntos y todas las cosas durante el año. I was just saying that when I was a college student, I studied abroad in Mexico. I then worked for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Mexico City. I helped to lead our leadership program, which was a group of young Mexican elected officials, politicians who were coming up through all three of the major political parties in Mexico, and I've got a lot of friends there. It's a relationship I care very deeply about, and I'm really excited to be part of this committee and do whatever I can to help strengthen the committee and strengthen members' understanding of the really special relationship that we have with Mexico. I think it's a vitally important relationship on a cultural level, on an economic level, on a diplomatic level. We've got so many opportunities. We also have so many challenges. And I was I just want to bring up, the other night there was a wonderful piece on Voces called El Poeta, which was all about the wonderful poet in Mexico City who lost his son to narco violence and then his caravan through the United States to talk about the drug war. So I'm also hoping that we're going to get an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the difficult issues that exist with our relationship and what we can do in the state legislature to help. So I'm excited about the hearing today and looking forward to participating.
Well, very good. There you go. We have a talented, learned committee and diverse, so we'll have a good dialogue. Today's hearing will consist of two panels. We will have an opportunity for member questions to any of the presentations and or discussion at the end of the panel. And finally, at the end of our hearing, we'll have public comment. We'll open it up to public comment. If any of you would like to speak, you're invited to come and share some comments. We would also like to ask if you would like to kind of sign in. We have a sign-in list. This is only to keep track of your information so that we can steal your identity, or you guys aren't paying attention. No, so we can send you information or just take note that you were here today for our record. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speakers on the first panel. Senator Morel, welcome. We will have with us today Dr. Pedro Noyola. Dr. Noyola is the CEO of Aclara. He also served as Mexico's Undersecretary of Trade and Foreign Investment and Undersecretary of Finance, and participated in many of Mexico's trade negotiations, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, acts, so he's come from Mexico to participate in this hearing. Dr. Noyola, where are you? Come forward. Don't be afraid. You can sit. You can sit here in the panel here and welcome. Thank you for being here. Thanks for making the long journey.
Well, it's not actually that long because I'm actually a California resident. I'll explain later.
Okay.
So I traveled from Berkeley, where I live
Okay,
now.
good. Even better. Not like the artesanos of Tonalá. They came in a bus 2,000 miles to be here. Anyway, whenever you're ready, sure.
Thank you.
Welcome, Dr. Noyola.
Thank you. I don't have to touch this. It goes.
I believe so. It has a button right there on the base. Can you get the mic to work for him? There you go. Good job.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the Select Committee on California-Mexico Cooperation, my name is Pedro Noyola. I am president of Aclara, a U.S. professional services company devoted primarily to the design and execution of procurement auctions. Aclara was founded in 2000 as a Delaware corporation authorized to domicile in California. The company wholly owns a subsidiary in Mexico where most of its clients are located. Aclara's mission is to create market contests, principally through structured auctions, that generate efficient, effective, and transparent results. Efficient by maximizing competition and revealing optimal prices, effective by promoting adjudication and contractual compliance, and transparent by binding all parties to explicit rules and traceable actions. Since its establishment, Aclara has designed and executed over 9,500 auctions for more than 150 clients. To date, ex-ante aggregate transactional value exceeds $21 billion, and the company's horizontal experience expands to more than 180 goods and services. Aclara's market events have generated savings of about $2.5 billion, equivalent to about 12% of expected prices. Before founding Aclara, I taught economics at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, served in Mexico's federal government as Undersecretary of Trade and Undersecretary of Finance, and co-founded SEN CA Consultores, a Mexican law and economics firm specialized in matters of competition, trade, and finance. I come before you to comment on three aspects of the Mexican economic ecosystem that I believe are particularly relevant to California's economy. First, its openness. Second, its integration to North America. And third, the quality of competition and economic transparency within its markets. On openness. In 1986, I was teaching mathematical economics in Spain and working on a research project to predict the fiscal and distributive impacts of the introduction of a national value-added tax, which at the time was a prerequisite to Spain's accession to the European Economic Community. One lazy summer afternoon, after completing the research project and while pondering if I should accept a long-term appointment at the university, I received a call inviting me to Mexico to return and join a team that would be tasked with crafting first a significant income tax reform, and then a long-term trade policy. Although the prospect of pursuing my academic interests at a fine and dynamic university appealed to me greatly, I decided to return to Mexico and engage in what I thought at the time would be a short-term tour of duty in civil service. When I landed in Mexico later that summer, I found the country struggling to rid itself of entrenched protectionist demons that greatly contrasted with the outward-looking spirits that dominated public and private discourse in the Spain I had just left behind. At the time, Mexico's weighted average import tariff exceeded 15%. This figure underestimated the highly distortive effects of the trade regime because tariff dispersion reached double digits and many items were subject to quantitative restrictions that in some cases made the equivalent tariff extraordinarily high. Not surprisingly, the Mexican economy in 1986 was quite closed. The international trade over GDP ratio barely reached 20%. Fast forward to 2015. Today, both the weighted average import tariff and tariff dispersion are less than 5%. And there are no quantitative restrictions to trade other than for sanitary and safety restrictions, toxic and hazardous materials, contaminated food, etc. Unsurprisingly, the Mexican economy today is quite open. The current trade to GDP ratio approaches 70%. On North American integration and competitiveness. In 1989, after helping design and implement comprehensive income tax reform, I moved to the trade front. To make a long story short, an ambitious regional agenda complemented Mexico's multilateral commitments and resulted in the negotiation of several free trade agreements, including NAFTA, which was enacted 21 years ago in 1994. So NAFTA today has come of age. By all trade measures, NAFTA contributed to make North America a more efficient and integrated economy. Since 1994, intra-regional trade quadrupled and intra-regional foreign direct investment quintupled. One current statistic stands out to me. The average U.S. content of goods imported into the U.S. from Mexico is about 40% of total cost. In contrast, the U.S. content of Chinese imports into the U.S. is on average 4% of total cost. Now that such a clear pattern of shared regional production has emerged, I think we can safely say that data, even more than logic and reason, ultimately and massively debunked the apocalyptic great sucking sound theory espoused by NAFTA's opponents. But perhaps California does create a sucking sound of sorts, that of the $25 billion of exports that are sucked into the Mexican economy every year. NAFTA also increased macroeconomic coordination. Prior to 1994, Mexico's growth cycle was statistically countercyclical to the US cycle, and interest rates and inflation in both countries were largely uncorrelated. In contrast, a recent statistical test of co-integration, the so-called Johansen test, showed that for short-term interest rates, inflation rates, and economic growth rates, the null hypothesis that those variables remain uncorrelated in the NAFTA region must be rejected. In other words, North American macroeconomic coordination today is much more than the title of that great Police album, Synchronicity. NAFTA also structurally boosted the region's competitiveness. What I mean is that, ceteris paribus, North American firms are more competitive post-NAFTA than they were pre-NAFTA. For example, consider the following three drivers that as a result of increasing co-integration help make North American firms more competitive vis-a-vis competitors in the world's fastest growing market, China. First, the demographic driver. NAFTA's dependency ratio, the population over the age of 64 divided over the population aged between 15 and 64, is lower in North America than it is in China. Second, a supply-side argument. NAFTA's energy and transportation costs are lower in North America than they are in China. And third, a green argument. NAFTA's marginal investment requirements to reach the so-called 450 scenario are lower in North America than they are in China. On competition and economic transparency. In the mid-90s, Mexico introduced a new competition law that gradually...
Just to clarify, what the 450 scenario?
Oh, I'm sorry. The 450 scenario is a scenario...
set of environmental standards?
It's an environmental standard presented by an International Energy Agency that puts up a path through which, if implemented, would allow the CO2 emissions to be limited to 450 particles per million, which is the standard that...
So the point you're making is that because it's so much closer, there's just a much lower footprint.
Right, and NAFTA's investment requirements to reach that level, that threshold, and not exceed it, are about 2/3 of the investment requirements in China to meet those.
Surely, that has to do with proximity, I'm sure, right? So
yes.
And the transportation of goods is so...
Well, and also the fact that today's existing fixed assets in North America are much more modern and compliant with environmental standards that they are in China. So, openness, integration. Finally, on competition and economic transparency. In the mid-90s, Mexico introduced a new competition law that gradually and systematically strengthened competitive forces in many sectors. However, insufficient and deficient competition continues to drag the economic ecosystem, especially in certain non-tradable sectors. For example, relative to the US, Mexico's Herfindahl Index, which measures supplier concentration, is 5 times higher in the oil sector, 10 times higher in the electricity sector, and 2.5 times higher in telecommunications and land transportation. Overall, supply of non-tradable goods and services is about 3 times more concentrated in Mexico than in the US. More concentration generally leads to less and worse competition and to an erosion of consumer surplus. This is not good. Moreover, Mexican government spend is often shackled by procurement rules that limit efficient, effective, and transparent competition. This negatively impacts the overall economy's competitive environment for 2 reasons. First, size matters. Distortions in Mexican government expenditure markets have significant ripple effects on the rest of the Mexican economy. Secondly, the demonstration effect. Government practices significantly influence the culture of doing business in the country. In 2009, the procurement law was reformed to introduce structured auctions and improve the quality of competition in public purchasing, augment public savings, and increase accountability and transparency. The reform was limited to purchases of goods and services and excluded public works contests, but it at least opened a window to a new procurement paradigm. Here, I transitioned to my transactional experience at Aclara. In 2000, after spending almost 2 decades of my professional life in academia, public service, and private consulting, studying, designing, and implementing economic policies to help make the Mexican economy more open, more integrated, and more competitive, I recognized that the quality of competition was still an Achilles heel that eroded efficiency, perpetuated rent-seeking, and in many cases, promoted self-reinforcing corrupt practices. So I set about to provide a transactional solution that would determine prices more efficiently and transparently than bilateral negotiations or restrictive sealed bid contests, and Aclara was born. When the 2009 procurement law was enacted, government agencies began to solicit Aclara's market-making services to help them design federal requests for proposals and quotations, and Aclara put auction theory and technology to work in government purchases. Since 2009, Aclara has designed 995 electronic auctions for various government agencies, including the Secretaría de Educación Pública, the Instituto Mexicano del Seguro Social, the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, and Petróleos Mexicanos. To date, ex-ante aggregate auction spend in the government surpasses $8 billion, average savings total almost $1 billion, a measure of efficiency, adjudication rates approach 94%, a measure of effectiveness, and contests are consistently sanctioned favorably by Transparencia Mexicana, a measure of transparency. The successful auctions executed since 2009 are only drops in the bucket. Too many public procurement markets remain highly concentrated, too many comfort zones remain unchallenged, and the shadow of corruption still hovers over too many contests. Mexico, of course, does not have a monopoly on inefficient government procurement. I can't help but wonder, for example, about the amount of consumer surplus lost each year in California to inefficient price dynamics and established comfort zones in state and municipal procurement contests. On this issue, Mexico's recent experiments with structured auctions are worthy of note. Moving forward, I expect the government to move steadily towards more auction-based contests. This would be consistent with the policies of openness, integration, and competitiveness that together define the last 25 years of Mexico's microeconomic policy. So I conclude with an optimistic outlook. If Mexico sustains its commitment to modernity and reinforces competition and transactional transparency, I foresee a brilliant future for the bilateral economic relationship between two nations that are neighbors by destiny and partners by choice. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yes, thank you for your comments. We have with us today we have visiting Dr. Robert Weisenmiller, the chairman of the California Energy Commission. Welcome. We're very pleased to have you. We're going to have questions. We've had more members that joined us. Assemblymember Luis Alejo, Senator Morel, and the chair of the Assembly Select Committee on Binational Affairs with Mexico, our very good Jose Medina, our profe. So you have questions, Senator Morel?
Thank you. By the way, just, you can answer these quick, just clarifying questions. You put a lot in a short amount of time, so it's hard for me to follow. So real quick, like you mentioned that you did tax reform in Mexico, was it?
Yes.
What was, just real quick, what was the problem and where did you get the tax rate to?
Actually, I was involved in tax reform on two occasions in Mexico. The first time was reform of the income tax code, basically to introduce what is called the inflationary adjustment of the tax base. At that time, Mexico had high inflation rates, so because of inflation, the tax base was eroded constantly. And in order to correct for that distortion, the tax reform consisted of making the Mexican income tax system neutral with respect to inflation. So no matter whether the inflation was 5% or 20%, the tax base would remain stable. That was the first part. The second part, which was after I went to trade and after NAFTA and I returned to finance, I was in charge of the separation of Mexico's tax revenue system, which at the time when I was in charge of it was responsible for income tax, for tax policy, for tax administration, and for customs administration. So I presented a proposal that today is to create an independent tax administration agency known as the Sistema de Administración Tributaria, pretty much akin to what today is the IRS in the US or FTB here in California. So those were the two aspects of tax reform and tax administration that I was personally involved with.
You talk, and you can give me even a quicker answer, so because I want to come up to speed with you. You talked about the VAT tax that you work for in Spain.
Yes.
So were you for it, against it, and what was the suggested rate that you came up with?
We actually, our job was to study the impact of the proposed VAT tax rates that Spain was going to introduce and substitution of its indirect tax system at the time, which was a generalized sales tax system. Their proposed tax rates were 6%, 12%, and 33%. Our recommendation was, our conclusion was that those tax rates were too high on average, and that what was going to happen is that Spain was actually going to have greater revenues than it was projecting, and with a bad impact on income distribution. 10 years later, we did a counterfactual study, and in fact, it was established that the VAT tax rates at the time had created additional revenues to those expected.
Okay, sorry, I just, real quick, another one, because it was interesting, North American versus China, and you talked about demographics and ages, but I didn't hear, because I'm curious about this, how do you see the age breakdowns affecting either North America negatively or positively versus China? You had mentioned something.
I have
about
superimposed the three demographic pyramids of Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and it's part of a presentation that you can have, that you could see that I'm leaving in PowerPoint that we don't have here. And I think as a region, we pretty much come up with what I would call the perfect demographic pyramid. And the problem with China's demographic pyramid is that it's at the lowest level, it's gotten very narrow. So it's young people are not a lot, then a lot of middle age and coming up so it's like that. Whereas NAFTA's demographic pyramid is almost a perfect little pyramid like this. And this means that we're going to have the ability to support through the demographics, the labor supply needs for decades to come, up through 2040, which is what I have modeled.
And then the last question, sorry to hog this here, you talked about corrupt practices, but give me two recommendations that you came up with, because
Structure,
and thank you, by the way.
structured auctions. One, so that the government can use auction theory to have better and more efficient prices. And secondly, to have independent auctioneers and independent auditors of the process, members of the civil society, be part of the process. That, I think, increases transparency and efficiency both.
Good luck on that one.
Well, well, there's been very good results with what we've done so far. We hope we could expand it more comprehensively.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.